All of you are familiar with the first law of thermodynamics. It is concerned with energy in the universe. It states that energy can neither be created nor be destroyed, but it can be transformed from one form to another. This is what you studied as first law of thermodynamics. It also indicates that when one form of energy is transformed into another form, the efficiency is never 100% because some of the energy is dissipated as heat or it is simply wasted. This also is applicable for our biochemical system. Cells are carrying out so many chemical and physical changes. So many chemical reactions are going on in the cell, and each of these change is associated with the change in energy. Some forms of energy are always converted into some other forms of energy. Let us see this process in detail. You see here, all of you are familiar with this. This is the process of photosynthesis. Here the green plants are there. They have the chemical system for the harvesting of solar energy. In the solar radiation, there is the light energy and also the heat energy. Of this, the photosynthetic machinery is harvesting light energy. Then the other raw materials are carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide is taken from the surroundings. In the case of land plants, it is taken from the air. In the case of aquatic plants, it is taken from the water. And water also is required as a raw material. So the inorganic carbon dioxide is combined with water to produce organic carbon. This is an energetically uphill reaction, which means this process requires an input of energy. In chemistry, you have studied that this is called endothermic reaction. And in biochemistry, we call it endergonic reaction. Of course, you have studied that oxygen is a byproduct of this process. This is just one example of energy transformation in the living organisms. And of course, this is the process by which all the organisms are surviving here upon the earth. Let us see some of the energy interconversions in the living organisms. In the process A, living organisms are harnessing energy. See, living organisms extract energy from their surroundings. How do you get energy? We get energy from the nutrients we are consuming, nutrients in the environment. It may be carbohydrate, it may be protein, it may be lipid. That means the food material we are consuming. All the animals are getting the energy like that. Then what about the plants? They are getting their energy from the sunlight. So that is process A mentioned here. And once we get energy into our body, it is used in a variety of functions, or energy transductions accomplish work. Living organisms are doing a lot of work. By the organism, work by the organism and work within the organism. Here, the energy we receive is undergoing chemical transformations within the cells. Cellular work is there, chemical synthesis of larger molecules from smaller molecules. Mechanical work is there, our muscles are doing mechanical work in the movement of the body. Osmotic and electrical gradients are there. Gradients are created, for the transport of metabolites from one cell to another. And light production is there. You might have heard of bioluminescence, how the firefly is producing light. It is a matter of life and death for them. So it is a life phenomenon, it's a biochemical phenomenon. And there is the genetic information transfer. You might have heard of the DNA duplication, multiplication of DNA. and protein synthesis. A variety of synthetic activities are going on inside the cell. So all these changes are involving transformation of energy. Energy is transformed from one form to another, and these processes are never 100% efficient, which means, as you see here, some of the energy is dissipated as heat into the surroundings. Look here, living organisms extract energy from the surroundings. That was a convert some of the energy into the useful forms of energy to produce work. That is case B. C, return some energy to the surroundings as heat. That means some of the energy is lost into the surroundings. And D and E. What is D? Increase the randomness. And E, this one, decrease the randomness. What is meant by randomness? You have called entropy. Entropy is the degree of disorder. You have studied in the second law of thermodynamics that during a spontaneous change, entropy of the universe increases. It's applicable in our living system also, because whenever a larger molecule is broken down into smaller, simpler molecules, there is an increased randomness. That means entropy increases. When the metabolism produces compounds simpler than the initial fuel molecule, it results in an increased randomness. And when there is the decreased randomness, when the smaller molecules are joined together to produce a larger molecule. Larger molecules examples are starch and cellulose and DNA and RNA and proteins, etc. When the smaller molecules are joined together to produce a larger molecule, it results in a decreased randomness. And you have also studied another word for this. Breaking down of a larger molecule into smaller molecule is called a catabolism. And synthesis of a large molecule from several small molecules is called anabolism. So during catabolic activities, randomness, entropy increases, while during anabolic activity, this randomness or entropy decreases. Look here, is an increased order, decreased randomness in the system in the form of complex macromolecule. And all these types of activities are taking place in the cell. There is change in entropy, there is change in energy content, there is the transformation of energy. All those things are taking place in the living system, and that is the physical basis of biochemistry. Look here, I told you just now that some of the processes require an input of energy. In the nature, there are some chemical reactions which require an input of energy. In chemistry, you have studied them as endothermic reactions. Here, this blue colored arrow mark is indicating endothermic reactions. In biochemistry, we call it endergonic reaction. While there are some other chemical reactions, some other processes which release energy. During the process, it is releasing energy, and in chemistry, you have studied them as exothermic reaction. Here we call it exergonic reaction. Remember, endergonic reactions which require input of energy are not spontaneous. They do not take place by themselves. On the other hand, exergonic reactions which release energy are spontaneous in nature, which means they take place by themselves. Then there's a question. How do endergonic reactions take place in the body? You look here, this diagram is explaining that technique very well. Here, in order to pull this block upward, it is connected with another block which is moving downward. You know that moving a block upward it requires input of energy, while moving it downward does not require any energy. Actually, it is releasing energy. So what I mean to tell you is that an exergonic reaction is coupled with an endergonic reaction, so that effectively the reaction can take place by itself. Is it really taking place? Yes. This is the example. You have studied this example in your higher secondary classes. Here, glucose combines with phosphate to form glucose 6-phosphate. Remember, this is a graph. You know what's the graph paper. On this axis, we have the free energy content G. On this axis, we have the reaction coordinate. So here is the energy of the substrate. Here is the energy of the product. Here, from this axis it is very clear, the substrate, the raw material, has a very low amount of energy, while the product has a very high amount of energy, and this is the delta G, which means the difference in energy between the substrate and the product. Since the product has more energy, the energy of the product minus that of the reactant or substrate is a positive value. Delta G is a positive value. What is meant by delta G? It is the energy of the product minus energy of the reactant. This is a larger value. This is a smaller value. So larger minus smaller. This is a positive value, and this is a typically endergonic reaction which will not take place by itself. This reaction will not take place by itself. Then how does this reaction take place in the beginning of glycolysis? You have studied glycolysis in your biology classes in higher secondary time period. It's very simple. You consider another reaction. This is ATP. ATP is broken down into, it is hydrolyzed into ADP and inorganic phosphate. This is the energy of the substrate ATP. Here is the energy of the substrate ADP and inorganic phosphate. Look here, ATP has a very high amount of energy, while the products ADP and inorganic phosphate have very low amount of energy, and energy of product minus energy of substrate, a lower value minus a larger value. This reaction has a minus sign. Delta G value is minus. It simply means it is highly exergonic. This reaction releases a large amount of energy, and you know what happens in the nature? This endergonic reaction is coupled with this exergonic reaction, and what happens here? Look at reaction 3. Glucose combines with the ATP, glucose and ATP, and they are giving rise to glucose 6-phosphate. Here is glucose 6-phosphate and ADP. Glucose and ATP together have a very high amount of energy, while the products glucose 6-phosphate actually has less amount. That means the reaction is now spontaneous in nature. Now the net reaction, reaction 3 is the net reaction. That net reaction is now spontaneous in nature. So in the nature, in the living body, there are several endergonic reactions which cannot take place by themselves. But in the body, they are taking place by themselves at the ordinary conditions of temperature and pressure. How? Because endergonic reactions are coupled with exergonic reactions. And this process is often catalyzed by enzymes also. Presence of enzymes make this process much more convenient and easy. That's why the living systems are much more efficient than the corresponding industrial process. Just for an example, you have heard of Haber process. It is not mentioned in this slide. You have heard of Haber process. Professor Fritz Haber invented that ammonia can be produced from hydrogen and nitrogen. You have heard of it. Nitrogen plus hydrogen gives ammonia. At a very high temperature and pressure, the efficiency of the process in that nitrogen plant is less than 10%. At a very high temperature and pressure, the efficiency of the process is less than 10%. But in the living organisms, in the pea plants, in the root of the touch me not plant, you might have heard of root nodules in pea plants, etc. There nitrogen fixation is taking place. The same process in which nitrogen and hydrogen combine to form ammonia is taking place under ordinary conditions of temperature and pressure. Because of the enzyme called nitrogenase, the efficiency is 100%. This is the advantage of biochemical reactions over the corresponding industrial or chemical process. Here, in all such chemical reactions, I told you the endergonic reaction should be coupled with an exergonic reaction. There, what is the exergonic reaction? It is the hydrolysis of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. We say adenosine triphosphate is the universal energy currency in organisms. It is the universal energy currency in organisms. What is adenosine triphosphate? This is a nitrogenous base called adenine. This base is called adenine, the same base which is present in DNA, RNA, etc. And this is a sugar called ribose. It is a 5 carbon sugar, carbon number 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. This is a 5 carbon sugar called ribose. So ribose plus adenine is equal to adenosine. Then what is it? It is adenosine triphosphate. Tri means how many? 3. Phosphate 1, phosphate 2 and phosphate 3. So this is the structure of adenosine triphosphate. The hydrolysis of adenosine triphosphate is highly exergonic. It releases a large amount of energy. Where is the hydrolysis taking place? Here is the first bond being broken. When this bond is hydrolyzed, it is releasing ADP, adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2 plus inorganic phosphate plus a large quantity of energy. But in some reactions, this much amount of energy may not be sufficient. Then what happens, this bond also is broken, which means one more phosphate is released along with a still larger amount of energy. Now this much amount of energy is sufficient to carry the endergonic reaction forward. This is how energy transformations are taking place inside the cell. This is how endergonic reactions are taking place inside the cell.